Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
How is everybody?
Wonderful.
I would like to welcome everybody to our last meeting of the Tortoise year. How many?
So now we'll be moving into brumation. How many of you guys, is this your first brumation season with your tortoise? Got a couple. Okay, awesome. So we'll go over typical fall behavior. This time of year is very common for tortoises to be most active. As I mentioned, out in the wild, they're moving around, but oftentimes in people's backyards, you'll see your tortoises moving around a lot this time of year, especially if they're males because they have heightened levels of testosterone because they're looking for a mate before they go down for their sleep. So a lot of the males will really be pacing. Their main activity levels are between 80 and 90 degrees. So when we want to be outside, they want to be outside too. Now, as the weather starts to cool down, your tortoise will start to slow down typically as well. Now, I know we have some exceptions to the rules. Some people's tortoises will eat all the way up until brumation, and some of them will really slow down and they won't eat at all. So that's not uncommon. Don't panic if your tortoise has stopped eating. Yep. So when, where, and how long will my tortoise brumate? So typically we say that brumation goes from mid-October to mid-March. Now this depends on a lot of other factors as well. Depends on the individual tortoise, it depends on outside weather temperatures and the length of the day. So tortoises have this internal clock just like we do. You know, most of us rise up with the sun, maybe not exactly when the sun rises, but they have that same internal clock that tells them when to go to sleep and when to wake up. So once it starts getting colder, they typically will start slowing down and then preparing for brumation, and they'll go down into brumation. Now last fall we had a really, really warm fall, and as Bob mentioned, our last tortoise at the habitat didn't go into brumation until the first week of December, which is pretty uncommon. But this time of year is when they start going into brumation. If it's really warm out, you might be seeing your tortoises through November, which is exciting for us. We all want our tortoises to be staying up as long as possible, I know it. But it is important for them to brumate. So if you don't have a proper place for them to brumate, we do have instructions on how to brumate a tortoise inside a box if an outside burrow is not available. So, as I just mentioned, your tortoise should brumate outside in a well-insulated burrow. It's important that your tortoise burrow doesn't flood and is well-insulated. And how you accomplish that is by placement, making sure that you're not putting it in a place that's going to flood from the drainage of your house. It's okay if it gets wet inside your burrow, but you don't want standing water. And how we accomplish the insulation is with dirt. A lot of it. So you saw Kobe standing on top of that above ground burrow, typically having about a foot of dirt on top of that frame. As I mentioned, if you don't have an outside burrow prepared for your tortoises, there are instructions on how to properly brumate a tortoise in a shed or a garage inside of a box on our instructions. And if you have questions about that, you can always ask me and I can go into further detail about that as well. So how long will my tortoise brumate for? As I mentioned before, it does depend on the tortoise. It does depend on outside temperatures. Typically, they start coming out of brumation around mid-March. Now, last year, again, we had a warm spell at the end of February, so we had a couple appearances the second 2 weeks in February, and then it cooled down again, so a lot of them came out. And then they're like, no, we're not ready for this. And they went back down for another 2 weeks. Now, when your tortoise comes out of brumation, it's still moving slowly. They slow down going into brumation, and coming out of brumation, they're really slow to come out of it as well. And sometimes they won't eat for several weeks coming out of brumation as well. So, brumation tips. So what you can do to help prepare your tortoise for brumation. I know a lot of people stress about brumation and they worry, especially if it's their first season, because they can't believe that they don't have to feed their tortoise for 5 months. which I know is shocking, but they're well prepared for it, and they actually know what they're doing. They've been around for millions of years. Most of these guys have gone through several brumation periods on their own, and I know that we worry as tortoise custodians, but have faith in your tortoise and have faith that it knows what it's doing. What you can do is offer extra water. So we typically recommend soaking your tortoise for about 15 to 20 minutes in a shallow bin or a Rubbermaid bin, as long as it's shallow water. Lukewarm, halfway up its shell. You want the tortoise to be able to keep its head above water because tortoises cannot swim. But you do want to have enough water that it can submerge its head if it so chooses. Tortoises can go several hours without oxygen. So if your tortoise is keeping its head underwater, nothing to panic about, but you do want it shallow enough that your tortoise can lift its head above that water line. A lot of people panic about it being too cold during the winter too, so a couple other tips that people have done in the past is crinkling up newspaper and sticking it in the entrance of the burrow. That helps reduce the air circulation coming in and out of the burrow, but it also makes it obvious if your tortoise does come out during brumation, then that they push that newspaper out, so then you know that your tortoise was out and about. Now, sometimes they will make appearances during brumation if they sense oncoming rain, and that's typically the only time we'll see a tortoise during the winter season. They do have a natural instinct to sense oncoming rain, so it's not uncommon for them to come out for a drink of water and then go straight back down into brumation. Yes?
What about your little ones? They're like, were just hatched this year. Should we leave them out or bring them in?
I would still recommend brumating them. You want to make sure that their burrow is nice and snug and well insulated for them. Juveniles have a harder time staying hydrated, so you want to make sure that they're soaked a lot beforehand. They're a lot more fragile than the adults. Yeah. Yep. I think that might be it. All right. Well, that concludes brumation.